When the rescuers looked at the file on her phone, they fell silent. The video was recorded in a snow pit in the dark. The woman in threadbare clothes barely moved her lips. "Mom, Dad, if you see this, it means I'm not back." The video lasted 1 minute and 42 seconds. It showed a man who was no longer being looked for. At the time of recording, Jennifer Marlowe had spent 5 days alone on Mount Shasta, without a tent, without communication, with a leg injury. No one was waiting for her. She left no contact information. A day after this recording, a rescue helicopter accidentally flew over the slope. The pilot was about to turn when he noticed a tiny movement in the snow. What happened to her between that first mistake and that moment became one of the rarest stories of survival in the American mountains. February 2014, Jennifer Marlowe, 35, stood at the window of her small apartment in Redding, California. Outside, a damp, gray morning. Inside, she felt stuck. Her life seemed to be at a standstill. Her advertising career was unfulfilling. Her personal life had reached a dead end, and her long-awaited vacation had coincided with a growing sense of anxiety. She had long wanted to challenge herself, not in the gym on a treadmill, not in another work presentation. A real physical challenge that involved risk and pushing her limits. A few years ago, Jenny walked part of the John Muir Trail. Something awoke in her, a sense of the strength that nature gives, but also an awareness of her fragility. Now she felt the call of the mountains again. The target was Mount Shasta, a majestic volcano towering over Northern California. It stood 13,500 feet, 4,817 meters tall. It was harsh, treacherous, but accessible to those who knew what they were getting into. A window of good weather was predicted for late February. She had 3 days to spare, and an overwhelming desire to disappear, at least for a while. Jennifer had experience. Dozens of moderate difficulty hikes, overnight stays in sub-zero conditions, basic avalanche safety knowledge. But she had never climbed alone in winter. When she told her sister she wanted to solo Shasta, her sister just waved her off. "You're not going to climb it alone, are you?" "It's just a walk. I'll be up and down before sunset." She lied. The plan was much more ambitious. Jenny wanted to reach the summit, spend the night in the Helen Lake area, and return the next day. On the morning of February 27th, she loaded the car with minimal gear: a light sleeping bag, a camping stove, food for 2 days, a GPS with an 80% battery, and sneakers instead of mountaineering boots. She decided that the snow would be quite dense in the morning. That was her first mistake. No one close to her knew her exact route. She left no note, did not register for a tour with the rescue service. As she drove north, an old Cher song was playing on the radio. Jenny smiled. Ahead was freedom, adventure, and a chance to feel alive. She didn't know that this very decision would put her on the brink of life and death 2 days later. Mount Shasta beckoned with its silence and grandeur. The white mass hung over the valley, reflecting the soft morning light. At 6:40 a.m., Jennifer parked her car in the parking lot at Bunny Flat, the standard starting point. A slight frost prickled her skin, but the wind was light The sky was cloudless. Everything seemed to be going well. She was wearing a light thermal suit with a running windbreaker over it. Her footwear was lightweight trekking sneakers with a waterproof upper. For a regular spring walk, it was passable. For climbing a 4,300-meter high mountain, it was suicide. Her backpack contained energy bars, a chocolate bar, a bottle of water, a spare jacket, a thin sleeping bag, and a cheap headlamp. No ice axe, no crampons, no emergency beacon. But Jenny was confident. She would climb to Helen Lake, set up camp, and storm the summit in the morning. The first few hours passed quietly. She moved confidently along the Avalanche Gulch Trail, slightly compacted by previous climbers. The weather held, and audiobooks played in her headphones. Around 11 a.m., the clouds started to thicken. Jenny didn't pay attention. Something was always swirling at that altitude. She was at about 2,700 meters when the first gust of wind hit her in the face. Within 30 minutes, everything was covered in a blanket of snow. In the mountains, they call it a whiteout. When the horizon disappears, the sky merges with the snow, and you lose your orientation completely. Jenny tried to get the navigator. The screen flickered and went out. Wet or cold, he died at the most inopportune moment. Visibility was less than 10 meters. The compass did not work correctly due to the magnetized headlamp. The tracks she had followed had disappeared under the fresh snow. At 2,800 meters, Jenny realized that going back was no easier than going up. Both trajectories were equally dangerous. The only thing left to do was to find shelter. She turned to the side, intuitively assuming that the slope was gentler to the right. After an hour of wandering in a hurricane-force snowstorm, her boots were soaked through. She couldn't feel her toes. When a small stream of snow began to flow from the summit, she realized that on this mountain, small mistakes can turn into fatal ones in a matter of minutes. By 4 p.m., the storm had entered what forecasters call a local snow squall. For Jennifer, that meant only one thing. She was stuck on a slope with no landmarks, in a thick blanket of snow, in soaking wet clothes, without a tent. Her flashlight began to flicker. The light was dim, but it was enough to spot a small natural outcrop, a kind of overhanging rock sheltered on 3 sides. She crawled toward it, cold and shivering. Her legs burned with a dull ache, the first sign of frostbite. Jenny knew she needed to create some warmth. She pulled out her sleeping bag from her backpack, but it was rated for plus 110 degrees C. With the temperature near zero and the wind blowing, it was more likely to retain the cold than to protect against it. She tried to melt the snow, holding a plastic bottle under her clothes. An hour later, it contained about 50 milliliters of warm water. She drank like a wounded animal, greedily in small sips. For dinner, half a chocolate bar and a handful of nuts. The wind had picked up during the night. She curled up in a ball, wrapping herself in a thin poncho and holding her backpack close to her side to block the airflow. It got worse towards morning. Her left leg was swollen. Her movements were slower. Jenny understood that every hour was critical now. But in this state, going down meant even greater danger, severe hypothermia, disorientation, possible fall. She recorded it on the voice recorder built into her phone. "If anyone finds this, I tried. I thought I could handle it. I'm sorry." The sound of the wind behind the microphone drowned out her voice. The night from February 27 to 28 was the coldest that month, with temperatures dropping to 14 degrees. Jennifer survived it, barely moving, afraid to lose the last bits of energy. Outside, the elements raged. Inside, only instincts remained. No fear, no hope. Just a mechanical, just a little bit more. Thus began her first night of 6. On the morning of February 28th, the snow had eased a bit, but it was an illusion of calm, not an improvement. Visibility had risen to 50 meters, and Jennifer tried to assess her situation. Ahead was a steep slope with a rocky cliff to the right. To the left was what looked like a descent. She decided to move that way. Bending at the knees was excruciating. Every movement caused a burning sensation in her toes and cramps in her calf muscles. She didn't walk, she crawled, using the icy ledges for support. Her hands were torn by the unevenness. The blood immediately froze on her skin. There was still no navigator. The phone died on the second day. All that was, she continued to crawl, although with each meter she realized, this is not salvation. This is survival, divorced from logic. Not a single person on the slope. Not a single helicopter in the sky. The shelter she found on the second night was worse than the first, a shallow snow hole behind an ice bank. She tried again to make a shelter out of her poncho and sleeping bag, but the wind tore at anything that wasn't pressed tightly against her body. She barely ate. The only food left was nuts and wrappers. The only thing that kept her going was water, obtained the old way, a plastic bottle, the warmth of her breath, patience. At some point, she tried to scream, simply out of desperation, but her voice broke in the first scream. When the sun sank behind the slope again and night fell on the mountain, Jenny thought seriously for the first time, they won't find me, and even if they find it, it will be too late. On the third day, Jenny's consciousness began to work in fits and starts. When she woke up, her snow shelter had become a trap. The temperature inside was slightly higher than outside, but it wasn't enough. Every night, her body was covered in a crust of ice. Her toes no longer hurt. They were just numb. It was a worrying sign. She continued to dig herself a miniature cave, deepening the entrance, strengthening the walls, hiding her face from the wind. Every movement took her strength. Every attempt to get out was a threat of an avalanche. On the fourth day, she began to shiver uncontrollably, a typical sign of deep hypothermia. She could no longer taste snow. It became her only food. She could no longer warm the bottle with her breath. Her lips were swollen. Her breathing was labored. When she tried to stand up on the fifth day, her left leg couldn't bear the weight. A sharp pain shot through her thigh. Perhaps a fracture or a severe sprain. In any case, movement was now impossible. At some point, in the light of the morning sun, she saw in the distance a tiny dot, like a silhouette of a person. She screamed, waved her hands, but the dot disappeared into the cloud. She still doesn't know. Was it a person or a hallucination? The phone was still dead. The navigator wouldn't turn on. The only device that worked was the camera. It was with her help that she recorded a short video on the evening of the 5th day. If anyone sees this, please find my sister, Sarah. Tell her that I fought until the end. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a farewell. That night, snow again filled the entrance to the shelter. She climbed out every 2 hours to clear a passage. Each effort felt like her last. On the 6th day, she began to have visual and auditory hallucinations. She heard footsteps as if someone was approaching the shelter. She saw lights. She heard someone calling her name. She knew it wasn't real, but part of her wanted to believe it. On the 6th night, Jenny didn't sleep at all. She just lay there, clutching the empty bottle she'd been drinking water from the day before, until a sound came along that changed everything. The distinct sound of helicopter blades. The morning of March 4th began differently. The wind died down. The clouds parted. Blue skies appeared over the slopes for the first time in 6 days. A weak winter sun broke through the frozen walls of her snow shelter. Jenny struggled out. Her movements were jerky, unsure. She could no longer feel her toes. Her cheeks were cracked and her lips were bleeding. But there was something more important. There was a sound in the air. At first, barely perceptible. Then, growing. The whirring of blades. Her first impulse was to stand up, but she couldn't. She raised her hand. She screamed. The sound was drowned out by her own wheezing. Then she grabbed the poncho, which had frozen to the state of polyethylene, and began waving it as best she could. The helicopter flew past without descending. For a second, she thought it was all over. But then came the second approach. It appeared over the slope and began circling, slowly, purposefully. Jenny gathered her last strength. She crawled towards the helicopter, raising her hand, pounding the snow, as if that sound could reach the pilot. A couple of minutes later, a rescuer in a red jacket came down from the car on a rope. He landed about 10 meters away, wading through waist-deep snow. Jenny couldn't even speak. She just nodded. He shouted, "Everything is okay. You're home." In those seconds, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe she had survived. She was secured in a safety harness, and the cable began to slowly lift them both toward the helicopter. The slopes of Mount Shasta disappeared below. The mountain that had almost killed her. The mountain she had underestimated. The mountain that had given her back. The helicopter took Jennifer to the emergency room at Mercy Medical Center in Mount Shasta. The doctors were prepared for anything: severe frostbite, exhaustion, possible loss of limbs. But the first thing that struck the emergency room doctor was that she was conscious. "How did you even hold up?" he asked, checking her pulse. "I just didn't want to die alone," Jenny croaked. The diagnosis was serious, but not fatal. Left hip injury, severe sprain, frostbite of the toes, 2nd degree without amputation, moderate hypothermia, weight loss about 7 kilograms in 6 days. When her sister Sarah arrived at the hospital, Jenny didn't cry. She simply squeezed her hand and said, "Thank you for remembering me." Sarah did not answer right away. There were tears in her eyes. Later, she would say that on the 5th day, she had already begun to order a funeral ceremony. The rescue operation began too late. No one knew where Jenny was. Only the mention of Shasta in the conversation gave the family a reason to call the emergency services. Another day and a half passed from that moment until the helicopter flew into the search zone, and only a random visual clue allowed the pilot to detect a flicker of fabric among the snow masses. This probability is 1 in 1,000. A day after the rescue, a helicopter pilot came to her room. "I barely noticed you. If the sun had been lower, I would have flown past." Jenny listened to him in silence and then asked, "How many are there that you can't find?" He looked down. "More than you think." Her story made local news, then national. But the real wave began after she posted that video she had taken in the shelter. There was no hysteria, no dramatic words, just a tired voice saying goodbye to life. The video has been viewed millions of times. People have written comments. "I was on the edge too. This brought me back." Sometimes one voice from the void can save others. Jenny's story became more than a tale of survival. It became a mirror, a reminder of how thin the line is between overconfidence and deadly error. 2 months after being discharged, Jennifer returned to Redding. Her life was not back on track. She didn't try. Advertising, her career, the gym, it all seemed foreign now. Physical therapy was slow but steady. The doctors said she would be able to walk the trails again, but Jenny no longer wanted to just walk. She was interested in something else. Why she had come to this. Why she had decided to go alone, without preparation, without communication, in a season of unstable weather. She began meeting other survivors, those who had survived avalanches, those who had spent nights in icy gorges, those who had fallen off ridges. And almost all of their stories began the same way. "I thought this wouldn't happen to me." In the spring of 2015, Jenny founded a small nonprofit organization, Second Summit, to educate climbers and hikers about basic winter climbing safety. They gave lectures, handed out emergency beacons, taught people how to fill out route sheets and when to turn around. She never climbed Shasta again. But one fall, driving past the base, she stopped at the parking lot where her car had been parked that day. On an old wooden sign, someone had hung a piece of paper in a plastic cover. "You don't always have to reach the top to win." She didn't know who had written it. Perhaps another survivor, perhaps someone who had been saved at the last moment, perhaps no one. But the words stayed with her. In the woods above the parking lot, you can still find a scrap of an old poncho tangled on a branch, a frozen plastic bottle pressed into the snow, traces of a shelter that was long ago covered. Each item is like a relic, a reminder of how close the line was. Today, Jenny runs workshops at schools and colleges. She speaks to the young, the confident, who think the mountains are just a hobby. She talks about white noise, about pain that won't go away, about sleep that could be your last. And in every performance, she repeats one phrase: "I didn't survive by force. I survived by embracing fear and letting it speak for the ego." This is not a story about a feat. This is a story about how to regain the right to make mistakes and about how not to leave your life forever on the side of a mountain.